So our next speaker will be Dr. Miranda Belarde-Lewis, who will be discussing writing for depth in the white cube. Dr. Miranda Belarde-Lewis is Zuni and Tlingit. She's an independent curator living and working within the Coast Salish territories in present-day Seattle. She guest curated exhibitions for the Frye Art Museum in Seattle and the Museum of Glass in Tacoma. Her exhibition essays can be found in the beautiful museum catalogues, Preston Singletary, Raven and the Box of Daylight, published by University of Washington Press, and Nature's Nation, American Art and the Environment, published by Yale University Press. So thank you and for joining us and presenting today, Miranda.
Keshi kota nawan dawa kia. Ho tazana dita lechina. Ho look at awan sequamish tap duamish on ulak nawa istisho emma getsana. So good morning, everyone. My name is Miranda Belarde-Lewis. I'm Zuni and Tlingit, and I have the privilege of being an uninvited guest on Duwamish and Suquamish territories, where I'm zooming into you from on the home, what is now present-day Seattle. I have a presentation for you here, writing for depth in the white cube. And for museum nerds everywhere, the white cube is our colloquial term for museum galleries. And it's a standard practice to paint it white. Sometimes we challenge that, sometimes we don't. And I will preface everything that I say today with thank you so much to America for asking me to be part of this incredible writing symposium, as I do still consider myself a junior scholar, junior curator, and have been blessed with the opportunities that I'm going to share with you today. And I'll also reference Dr. Maithlo when she said that there's not one way, there's not one truth, and also Dr. Aton for saying that we're all contributing pebbles into these chasms that have been created over a long period of time. And it's going to take a long time to fill those chasms. So here we go. So when we're writing for depth, one of the questions that I really want us to think about when we're working in spaces that are mainstream, and I'm using air quotes, that are mainstream, that are traditionally white spaces, you know, what is the goal of the text and what do you want to be communicated? And so what Adrian was really asking us to do when we're thinking of this big idea is to come up with this sentiments, these concepts that we're really trying to hammer in through the interpretive text, through the object placement, through the color schemes, through the sounds that we use, all of these aspects that go together to create this package and this experience that we want people to walk away from. What are the messages that we want them to really take home? And, you know, we can go into prior knowledge of the audience, what we assume about them, about their exposure based on what type of institution we're working with. But these are really fundamental questions that need to be asked in the curatorial space, but also in the writing space. So when she said less is more, I was laughing because the text that I'm going to show you have a lot of words in there. But in this case, this is from Stormy Weber, Casino, a Palimpsest. This was at the Frye Art Museum here in Seattle. And so there was, we really did pick and choose which pieces, which assemblages, which objects had interpretive text. Sometimes we just let them stand alone. And because Stormy is an author, is a poet, is a performance artist, sometimes we just let the pieces stand alone as their own performance pieces. And so in this way, the pieces that she brought in, and that's a great question about objects, because sometimes they are objects. If it's a photograph, it's an object. And so in this piece here, we really wanted to explain and get to this messaging of erasure, this message of stolen bodies. And so what do you do when you are the product of a stolen body? And so she, in this case, wanted to recreate the journey that her grandmother and her grandaunt, her grandma's sister, had to take as little tiny kids. And so what did they need to be able to be safe, to feel loved, to feel like they were ready to take this journey to Seattle with their biological father? And, for children, understanding that as kids, they had no choice in the matter. So if she could recreate this, how could she do that in a way that really paid homage to the fear and the trepidation that these little girls must have been feeling? And just by happenstance, these two little tiny mucklucks were in this weird collection at the Frye that wasn't quite accessioned in, that was a gift from somebody, and that they just held on to and took care of. And so it was just like this cosmic timing that made sense for us to include it in the exhibition, in this site specific installation for Stormy to recreate. And when we say that there was pieces that are we packed this kayak with a lot of things that were meaningful to her, we didn't feel the need to disclose that to the public. We said there are medicines, there's traditional medicine inside the kayak, and depending on who was going through with us, we told them what was in there. But for the most part, we just left that as is, because there's a lot of things that don't need to be listed all the time. And so that was another way that we challenged that. And I really thank the Frye for being open to how we wanted to interpret these pieces. For Allison Bremner, when her show opened up, Allison has incredible words to say about her work. And so we had this back and forth exchange through emails, through text messages, through in-person conversation, and really speaks to Heather's and Nancy's, everybody's comments really about building relationships and maintaining those relationships. So between the artist and the curator, between the artist and the writer, between the artist and the institution, you really can't get to this depth without conversation, without building that relationship. And so for both of these, for all of the artists that I'm speaking with and about today, has really taken a lot of time and care into creating this back and forth exchange that really allows for a lot of ideas to grow. And it's okay for ideas to not go anywhere, but to get those ideas out, to figure out what that big idea is, and to see if it resonates, all of the tangential pieces that come into play, if those ideas really help support that big idea, or if maybe they're just us dreaming about what could be. And so when this piece, Chemically Tanned, this is one of the pieces that did get a longer label in Allison's exhibition. And it's because it was so multi-layered that we really wanted to have her voice there. And throughout Allison's exhibition, I was deeply influenced by the Here and Now exhibit that was at the Burke Museum years ago, curated by Katie Von Marcuse, where she took a step back and really put the artists' voices directly in there to talk about the piece. And I think that is just an incredibly powerful way for the artist to directly communicate with an audience. And so even if they're not there in the gallery, their voice is still there. And so for all the pieces for Allison that had a longer label, we always included a quote from her first to explain her process or to explain what she wanted folks to know. And then I would add something in there afterwards. So on this one, I'm going to start off with the sound, and then I'll talk about it.
Tiaria aslachel at il heg haju. Zaluk at il haju. Hakwalti il dufas algua. Go akui il at il stabu. Gualtiad stirks algua titiab. Hal titiab. Tu ala tu ti titiab ataka. Baros kalalatu atilok atitiab. Swechwe adad. Stop shadad. Bad kalalatu. Gualatu tia sladai. Tu tia atatil stabu. Ohoya chalat. Lo at ti. Sapas pastad. O ibas tu titiab kohoma nupinka. Atiswatuhtad. Dwal tiswatuhtad atahwalch. Gwaldiadi altiil swatuhtad. Tiaria quis chagus. Gwaltiaria altid stihuatad a quis chist. Baro tag chagusya quis chist atitsil slad si ab. Salalatu atiet stabsh. Masista.
So the voice that you heard is Noelle Purser Rosario, who is a Suquamish tribal member. And part of this was Stormy's acknowledgement that she is also an uninvited guest on Coast Salish territories. And she really wanted to have the first experience of people walking into her gallery to be that of a Coast Salish. And that was her way of respectfully acknowledging that she is on Coast Salish territory, that she's Sukyak and Black, and that she's here not of her own choice, but still in a respectful way. And so what she wanted to do here was, we had this massive, you can see this image on the left, this massive blow up of what the waterfront used to look like in Seattle. And she wanted the first encounter with her space to be the people of the land. And so this part about being in community and building relationships extends beyond the artist. And so when you're looking at who is part of this home community, wherever the exhibition is, we were able to ask, I was able to ask Noelle, who is a friend of mine, about if there was stories, if there was something that she wanted to share about either the land itself, which was a main idea for Stormy's exhibition, this idea of movement or migration, or if there was something about Two-Spirit, because that's how is Stormy, that is who Stormy is. And so in the story of Kahuma Nupinka, they were a Two-Spirit person who lived at the same time as Lewis and Clark. And so this story told in Lushootseed, which is the language of the Coast Salish people and spoken by Suquamish folks, was really our way of doing that. You can see this image that you'd think that I paid this guy to stand there like this, but I just happened to catch him listening and following along with the words. And it was a way of reframing folks's interaction with the entire space. Oh, okay. We also did this in Allison's exhibition, where there was this concrete poem that was on the wall. There was the voices of Allison and Paul Marks II that were being broadcasted to the Star Trek type of soundtrack. And so this really reinforcing this idea that there are languages other than the dominant languages. And so thank you very much to America for expanding on that, especially when we think of our our Southern brothers and sisters. And so if we're challenging English, if we're challenging Spanish as dominant languages, if we're challenging French up in Canada, how is this going to be brought in, and how do we help encourage phonically sounds that we don't hear every day? I included this image just to show that when we talk about authorship and guests, there's definitely not enough people on permanent staff in museums, in galleries. And so Candace Hopkins was thinking about this just last week or so. I saw an Instagram post where she was really questioning, where are the permanent staff? And so you can tell that from this, I signed all of my intro wall text with my name. Part of that is because I'm there on contract and they need to know that there is this outside person being brought in, but also because we're challenging this institutional voice. And so if we can attribute specific quotes to specific people, then we should do it. I really appreciated Adrian's comments about that. So we can also build layers through the catalog. This is an image of Raven in the Box of Daylight. And the two images, the one in the middle is from my essay that really talks about how we pulled in different stories to build one Raven in the Box of Daylight story. There are dozens of Raven in the Box of Daylight stories. They belong to different people, different clans, and really differ depending on if you're coastal Tlingit or inland Tlingit. And so we included 5 different stories. And so when the catalog was a way for us to really talk about that and to start to unpack how this was such a rich story. And another way to do that was the image on the right is a conversation and an interview. And so if you're able to do an interview with the artist, that is another way to really start to get to what the artist wants to talk about. I'm a huge fan of letting the artists be the ones to really try to make their voices shine and be heard, because obviously they have these incredible things to say visually. They also have it to say when they're articulating their thoughts about their own work. So here, sorry, this is kind of a blurry photo here, but in the middle, we also had access to the stories that were transcribed, that were translated from Tlingit into English and then transcribed and translated. And so we included as many of those as we could, and to really start to bring people into the story itself through the depiction of the objects and pairing it with the stories. So Nature's Nation, when the curators were asked me to write for a specific object, I wrote about a historic Chilkat robe. But I also used that opportunity to bring in artists, in this case, Clarissa Rizal and Lily Hope, to bring in their voices, their vision, and to talk about contemporary works. So even though you're being asked as a writer to write about a specific object, you have autonomy to bring in related concepts, to bring in related works, and to really start showing that there's this continuum. It's not just something that happened in the past, it's happening now, and it will continue into the future. And so how you're able to bring those voices in, that is a big part of us holding the door open for other folks, is to say, well, let's bring in these other artists, let's bring in these other voices, and let's see what, let's get them some shine, because they're doing incredible work and people need to know. This is a nod to Heather's talk yesterday about contributing pebbles to fill the canyon. And so I was asked to write an introduction to Marianne Nicholson's work for Aperture magazine. And Aperture magazine in this special issue, and in Nancy's point is very well taken, that, you know, we have enough special issues. We need a dedicated journal, peer reviewed, so that way folks like me who are on the tenure track can add it to our CV, but also that we can start getting more and more out there to represent people's accurate messages. I'm trying not to use the word authentic because I think that it gets misconstrued. But if we can get an accurate message from the people that are actually doing the work, then that would be amazing. I included on here this cover of Nicholas Glennon's monograph. I just helped support by buying a copy of it before it went to print. But I don't have a piece in here, but I wanted to give a shout out to Minor Matters Books, which is here in Seattle. And the owner and the founder of it, Michelle Dunmarsh, who introduced me to Aperture magazine, where she used to be the editor, you know, so we're trying to find these areas that we can really cultivate these relationships. We can cultivate the artist voices, and the more that we can do, the better for everyone. I'll finish with these two examples here because I've heard this this phrase used before of heart work and really centering the art. But you know, if we think about the relationships that we have in Indian country, across Turtle Island, however you want to call the land that we're on, and you want to think about, we are already in relationship with each other. Either we're related to each other or we know each other. And I don't think that that is a negative. Sometimes it gets called bias, subjectivity, but really it's acknowledging these networks that we have and that have been built for generations. And so let's privilege and leverage those networks. And so if we have friends that are writers, if we have friends that are editors, we have friends that can help us out. How do we do that so that way we can really lift each other up? And so this is an excerpt from an essay that I did for Marwin Bigay for his catalog at the CN Gorman Museum. And it was such a pleasure to chat with Marwin. It didn't even feel like I was doing research, you know, for the piece. It was really lovely to just talk with him about what he wanted to communicate. And then out of this, I wrote a very personal type of essay for him, for his catalog. I did the same thing with Deani Whitehawk. And, you know, in this case, it was her really needing folks to contribute something that was inspired by her work. And so in this one, that was the specific ask that she made, was that folks really either reflect on a piece or write a piece of poetry that was inspired by her pieces. And in any rate, that was what we contributed. And so I can't wait to see the collection that came out of that ask. But you know, we have these networks, so let's leverage them in ways that make sense for writing about the art, and really challenge this idea of a formal analysis, because sometimes that's not the way to go. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's really about how these pieces are making an impact in our own selves, how they're reflecting beauty to us, to be reminded of that. And it is something that we can all do, because if we don't know these writers, if we don't know, we all have community, we all have these relationships. And so how we make those work for ourselves to really challenge this idea of a canon, or to challenge establishment, I think is all the better, and really makes moves towards indigenizing these spaces that have worked so hard to keep us out. So with that, I'll say elaka and gunachish, and I'm leaving us here with a quote from Dr. Kahete. Our people are like corn. Each one will grow up to be their own plant, but to grow and mature needs to be supported by other kernels. And I heard him say this one time and I just busted out crying because it just made so much sense for Native peoples to really work together and to start building each other up. So I think that with the writing, we can work towards a lasting method of doing that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments. I really miss having conversations with you. We should
Same.
hang out sometime. No, I think you bring up such an important point about relationships and the fact that, you know, a lot of us work for institutions, but we are not those institutions, and focusing on, you know, the reciprocal, you know, web of relations that we have, you know, within our communities, but also among professional colleagues. What would you say to, you know, young folks, students, emerging professionals, who are trying to build those networks and those relationships, who may be hesitant to reach out to folks? What would you say to them?
I would say to remember that we're all just people. I know that the first few times that I reached out to Nancy Mithlow, that like I was so starstruck and like afraid to send an email, which now I think is kind of goofy, but I was really nervous about that. And the first time I met Heather Autone, I was like, oh my gosh, hello, Heather, you know, like ready to bow down. And then we just laughed about all kinds of about amazing topics that had nothing to do with art, that had everything to do with just figuring out that we're all people. And so I think taking folks off of these pedestals is a really big move towards reaching out to folks and just asking questions, because yeah, we're all busy, yeah, but we all have email. We're on different social media platforms, and um, I think that's a big step, is just to remember that like, you have something important to say too. And you know, having these conversations is a really great way to start getting yourself introduced to the field also. I don't know if that really answers the question, but
Yeah, it did. I actually want to return to a question that came up after Adrian's presentation, because I think that it came up in yours as well, where you were talking about authorship and how to mark and recognize and give credit to, you know, multiple perspectives and contributions of community and artists within gallery spaces.
so what is the question?
How, like, do you have, you know, how would you go about doing that? I know you talked about signing your name, but you know, how do you think institutions should recognize community and other kinds of contributions to exhibition content?
I loved Adrian's comment about let's look at the budget as a moral document, because there, I mean, especially having those very honest and sometimes awkward and clumsy conversations at the very beginning can really set the stage for how you, me speaking as a guest curator, I can push for a commitment from the institution at the very beginning. And so making sure that there's money that's going to be there, especially if they're asking me to go out and find somebody that could do something like this, you know, like, well, let's make sure that they're going to get paid before I even ask them, because that is a huge part. It's not the only aspect of equity work, but we could start with the budget, you know, and making sure that folks are compensated and compensated well. And so that is part of it there. Another one, I really liked the suggestion yesterday. I think it was Nancy that said to start with the home community of wherever you are. if you don't know where to start with the home community. There's tribal centers, there's organizations, there's arts organizations. We were kind of laughing about this before the panel today, before the gathering, about if you can't find the website, come on, that's just a cop out. Like, everybody has a website, so you can find the information, you can find somewhere to start, and from there they can tell you who to go to, but you have to start somewhere. And I think now we're getting to this point of reckoning with institutions where we're not letting them cop out with easy answers or easy excuses, because we have so much information at our fingertips that it's no excuse to say, well, we couldn't find somebody.
Exactly.
Yeah, and thank you, Miranda, again. And there's actually a question from Kedra in the Q&A. She's asking if you could recommend any like additional scholarship on Two-Spirit or like non-binary being. Yeah.
On which topics?
On Two-Spirit, non-binary being.
Oh man, I am not the expert there. I think we're going to ask the crowd to crowdsource on here, but you know, Stormy, that is, I think, part of the issue here of why Stormy is also getting, we're in talks to have a discussion out at Harvard here in a couple of weeks. And you know, when it comes to Two-Spirit LGBTQ community, I think that the folks that represent that community are also feeling a lot of pressure, because there's not, from what I know, not a whole lot of literature about the artists that are working in the spaces. I mean, from what I've seen, I follow a lot of social media accounts. So like Geo Neptune is a really powerful Two-Spirit voice that's coming out. Jamie, do you know other folks that are other resources that we can point towards?
Yeah, in terms of more scholarly work, Michelle McGow has done some really interesting research. Other artists, Dana Danger is someone who folks should look into their work. There are just, it's an interesting area because it's almost like the artists are the ones who are doing the writing as well, which is interesting because, you know, usually when we teach about things, we try and find things that, you know, curators or art historians have written, but oftentimes I find myself going directly to the artists themselves.
Right, right. And that's an interesting point too, that the artists are the ones that are doing the writing, that are doing the scholarship, that are doing I liked Nancy's comment yesterday too about like, we need the artists to make things, even if that's TikToks. And I love Geo's TikToks. So that is content production as well. And so if we're looking at really challenging this authority of the curator's voice or the scholar's voice, you know, we can look to social media platforms to see how people are directly reaching their audiences.
Yeah, and I think in the chat there were many people mentioned a couple of names, so I guess everyone can also look up those as well.
That's great.
And
I love
also,
crowdsourcing.
yeah, yeah, and I also shared Geo Neptune's social media if anyone would like to take a look at it.
So one other question that I wanted to ask you is talking about ceding authority. And, you know, I think a lot of people approach curatorial work as like having this authoritative voice that Adrienne mentioned. That's not, I don't know, it just never seems natural to me to approach my work in that way. And I don't see that out of your work as well. why do you think that, like, what is it that makes you, cede authority, and not just as a choice, but just the way you are and the way you interact with the artists and communities you work with?
On a personal level, I think it's because I'm my grandfather's granddaughter, and he was the governor of our pueblo for 30 years. And my great grandfather was also governor of our pueblo for several decades. And so I think that that idea of diplomacy has always been part of my own personal upbringing. And being Pueblo, growing up in Zuni, we have to get along because we've been together for thousands of years. And so that creates a really different working relationship. On a research side, I was trained by Dr. Cheryl Matoyer, who's Eastern Band Cherokee, and she has taught us from a space of co-creator. And so co-creator methodology is really about, we all bring something to the table, much in the same way that standpoint feminist theory acknowledges everybody's own viewpoint and experiences and how it shaped us. But co-creator means that we are building something together. And it depends on your contributions, it depends on my contributions, and together we're going to create something really beautiful. We don't know what that is yet, and we're not putting prescriptive measures on it, but we know that we are going to create something that is going to be unique because of who is there at the table. And that's something that I bring into my relationships with artists, is that we're going to figure out what it is that we're building, and we're going to do this together. And so I think that that makes it a lot easier for me to leverage that ask from institutions to say, you are going to be the voice of authority. And so on the side, that's just kind of what I'm doing. I don't need to communicate that to the institution, because what I deliver is a package for them to install, right? They don't need to necessarily know that that's the process, even though a lot of times I do tell them that that's what is happening and how that is going to develop and evolve.
Yeah, and I think that resonates with what you already acknowledged from Heather Ottone's comments yesterday about adding your pebble to the canyon, but also the ways that our work is, reliant upon one another, and that we're, working as a team, as, collaborators in a lot of the work that we do. And I think it also creates, space to, push against ideas about deadlines and other things as well, and to kind of humanize the work that we're doing.
Right.
We are at our time for a break. So folks who need to take a break, feel free to step away. Those of you on our panel who are able to turn your cameras on and join for a conversation, I think we're hoping Adrian can come back, and maybe we could spend a little bit more time together talking about labels and authorship. We had some questions that I think, relate to what both of you were talking about in terms of, not privileging the English language, and including translations, or privileging Indigenous language on label text. Miranda, do you want to talk about that first?
Sure. Which part?
Whichever part.
Well, I think I'll start with the non-English or non-dominant language, because I thought that that was such a great point that America was making yesterday about, for acknowledging North America, like where are you drawing the line? And that's not just the US and Canada. And if we're looking at and really building a space that challenges viewers and makes that Indigenous voice primary, then they have to hear the language. And, you know, I'm not a fluent speaker by any stretch, but what I do know is incredibly humbling about the depth of knowledge that is embedded in our languages. And for other folks to even just get a chance, you know, I mean, there was so many visitors at the Frye that said that that was the first time that they had ever seen Fontuzzi, which is the Lashutsi font when it's typed out. And that was that was the first time ever hearing the Lashutsi language. And so same thing for Tlingit. And so exposing them in different ways, engaging different senses, I think really helped to create an environment that showed them that this was going to be something different. Even if they get in there and it's wall text and tombstone labels and, you know, it's like a traditional gallery, but no, we want you to think differently about what you're about to experience. And so the language was a really powerful way to do that. Adrienne, did you want to add something to that?
Sure, and I think thank you so much, Miranda, for your presentation. And I had noted in the panelist chat, I hope to have COVID safe tea with you sometime.
I would love it.
Talk about. I think what you're talking about too, in the way that you're approaching text and Indigenous language, is that in that way, that text no longer becomes just interpretive. Itself is the experience, and itself is the subject of the exhibition as well. Like it is. So I think it's performing several different functions there when you include the Indigenous language in its own script. We did get a lot of questions in the chat about including additional languages, maybe just from a functional standpoint of serving our changing audiences that are that don't speak English. And certainly there are some resources online to guide and best practices for that. The idea of including Indigenous languages, not as necessarily a functional act, but as a political act and as an act of reconciliation and of decolonization. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Hearts of Our People exhibition. And in the chat, I will link to a reflection from one of the interpretive staff members who unfortunately is no longer there, Julien Chevalier, that provides some insight into the decision-making of that practice. And I know a tremendous amount of work and care and love went into that practice, and those are, you know, for a variety of pragmatic reasons, something that not all museums can undertake. So I think that there are ways that institutions can integrate native text and language into labels that isn't necessarily the model put forth by Minneapolis. The other thing I would mention is just be mindful, kind of responding to some of the questions I saw of how to use text in a way that doesn't position a hierarchy. And so thinking about how can you surface and celebrate languages without necessarily positioning them as ancillary to the English text. Those would be questions I would ask, and actually questions that kind of go part and parcel in conversations with graphic design as well, not just the actual writing of the text. And I lost my train of thought, but yeah, those are some immediate things that come to mind.
And so, and a nuts and bolts thing to add on to that was when we included that Fontuzzi, we had to have it mocked up in Illustrator. And so
Yes.
then we had to print it as an image. We couldn't just do it as usual text the way that you would when we created the vinyl label. So then when we wanted to put it on the wall, I mean, we had to have an image of the text and not the text itself. And so that was something that we hadn't considered at the beginning. So it allowed for less flexibility if Noelle spotted errors or if she spotted typos because we were transcribing it onto, you know, using the Fontuzzi keyboard. And so that we had to be really, really careful before we hit send on that order for the label itself, for the image itself. So it was something that like a very technical detail that I wasn't aware of before incorporating that.
Absolutely. I've encountered similar issues of, we were including languages in high level vinyl, and the number of diacritics that accidentally got, broken off in the production process, or it is something that you really do need to budget time and money for, because it's not something that our English-oriented systems are set up to address.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be limiting. I think that's an important component of thinking about this, is that for the loan that we are receiving when First Americans Museum opens this fall, we've been working with the tribal communities. And if you recall me mentioning, we have 39 tribal communities in Oklahoma, each with their own distinct language. And some of the languages are related, but you can't simply just assume that the terms are exactly the same. The endings are not exactly the same. And one of the things that I'm really excited for audiences to see is that we have in our consultations, these are objects that were collected during that salvage paradigm, by and large, and many of them have not been connected back with their tribal communities since they were removed. And we went and took the objects, like, documents, not the actual objects, but documents and information about the objects, back to the tribal communities and ask them to help us to give them back their own name, so that the first thing that you'll read on the label will actually be the tribe's name for that object rather than the English word. We will have English in translation and parenthetically adjacent to it. But all of that kind of consideration forced us to we are working with Ralph Applebaum Associates in New York. And this was a challenge for them because it meant that we were working with so many languages that, as Miranda, you were describing, that the graphic work of it, we did actually import and create a library for all of these fonts that are appropriate to each language, but also had to document how they looked, because while we, for a period, had a linguist on staff and helped us to facilitate this process and create a reference document upon which we are relying, we will not be able to go back, from making a production. You've got all these deadlines, and sometimes those deadlines don't allow you to take a label back to the tribe and ask them to confirm it. And so once we had a confirmed visual representation, we turned that into a PDF, and we have a PDF for every label in the gallery to make sure that that represents all of these languages, so that when we go back to do the proofing, we don't lose a diacritical mark. It also forced us to make a change in our sort of museological approach to that gallery, in that there are 2 languages in Oklahoma that use capital letters as diacritical markers. And so what we had to choose to do or choose not to do was, it's very common, for instance, in the noun assignment to an object, to use a capital first letter with the term, assuming that as a name. We had to make a choice, and in the gallery, in the NMAI gallery, we are not using any capital letters unless it's a diacritical marker. And so people will probably be taken aback by this, but I appreciate that our exhibition designers felt like it was our choice to make as an institution trying to work with these Indigenous principles to set forward a path of moving forward in this regard. And so we rejected the use of capital letters in all of the titles, in order to allow, when a capital letter was being used, that it could be read by those readers and speakers of that language as a diacritical marker, and not to have a mistake applied because an E was a capital letter, but it wasn't trying to be a capital E in their language. So these are all very fine tunements that an institution simply has to make a commitment to want to wrestle with. But I will tell you, I thought that it was really worth it when I reached out to community members, and they are so excited about this kind of work, that for them to know that their name is the first thing people will encounter in text in relationship to that object really was affirming for them, that their cultures mattered to this object, and it mattered to our institution to support that. So anyway, 140 some odd objects coming that all have their names reattached. That's kind of its own victory in our galleries.
And Heather, the work you guys are doing is so essential, and I would encourage other institutions that are considering embarking on this work to also give yourself the grace that you will mess up.
Absolutely.
And labels can be changed.
Yes.
So don't become so brittle and worried about messing up that it doesn't happen at all. And I've seen that happen at different institutions. And I think that it's important to work, just if you're focusing on right relation with your community members, they're going to understand if something happens in the production process, and that these labels are living objects that can be changed. They're $15. It's going to be okay.
I think that is so incredibly critical in the humility of recognizing that, and it's something that our team is very concerned with, as rightfully they should be, to have done our best. But I have told them only the creator makes things perfectly. So we're going to make some mistakes, but we'll find our way through the process. And I think that's, that judgment and also that humility that we have to just sort of both expect, but also be kind to one another in the process.
Indeed, the best editors, copy editors, are a gaggle of docents or your elders and aunties going through and finding every mistake that despite your best efforts, you did not find.
Yeah, that's pretty complex with 39 tribes, but yes.
Yes.
Yes. And to that point of the docents, when we were talking about creating depth and an echo of voices in the White Cube and the gallery spaces and museums, I worked intensively with the docents, with the staff of the Frye Art Museum. Shout out to David Strand, who really was critical to what the success of those two exhibitions there. But also to just for them to having that foresight that we need to train the docents. And so that was some additional labor that I really spent a lot of time on, was to make sure that they understood the messaging that was being communicated by the artists. So that way, when they were those proxies, when they were the stand-ins, they had accurate messaging to relay to the visitors who always have a ton of questions, especially because the Frye is not known. I mean, it's building a reputation now for having more challenging questions and more challenging exhibitions, but we were really towards the beginning of that process. And so acknowledging the average patron that was coming through would just need a lot more of that echoing from the labels, from the docents, from the staff, whoever they encountered. And so that training and that work of relationship building extended beyond just the people I was directly working with there.